Welcome to our EC Experts Election 2020 event. We are looking forward to an educational and thought-provoking discussion tonight with four beloved and long-standing faculty members from Emmanuel's Department of Political Science and International Studies. Joining us tonight are Dr. Lenoir Martin. She is a professor of political science and chair of the department. Her areas of expertise include international relations, most especially in the Middle East and Turkey. Dr. Marie Natoli is the professor of political science. Her areas of expertise are American politics, with an emphasis on the presidency and vice presidency. She also teaches several law courses at the college. Dr. Adam Silver is an associate professor of political science. His areas of expertise include American politics, political parties, and campaigns and elections. Last but not least, Dr. Petros Vamvakas is an associate professor of political science. His areas of expertise include interaction between the domestic and international on issues of security and democratization. He had to put that very hard word in there. Thank you all for submitting questions during this event registration. We will use those to start our discussion. One note, we know that the political climate in the United States right now is very tense. The goal of tonight's program is not to add to that tension, rather to present information and opinions from our Emmanuel experts. We enter into this discussion in a spirit of goodwill, and let's begin. Our first question is to all four faculty. Let's start with Dr. Marie Natoli and go around. I'll call on you when she's done. What characteristics do voters want in a president? And I'd be remiss if I didn't say you have 2 minutes uninterrupted.
Well, you know, it's been said that nations don't always get the leadership they need, but they get the leadership they deserve. And I think it's because we don't look at what we want in a president. We look at a lot of superficials and a lot of misinformation. So I'm saying that character is the most important to be thinking about. You know, again, another phrase, as the twig is bent, so goes the tree. We want to look at, one of my favorite political scientists is James David Barber, who wrote the book Presidential Character, who looks at the formative beginnings of individuals who have entered politics. So looking at what someone's background is like, what contributed to whom they are as a person is important. Relatedly, I look to civility, which is a critical dimension for me as far as character is concerned, as is morality. One of the things that is all too often missing in American politics these days is a sense of empathy. So that too is important. Trust is critical. In looking at materials and teaching my presidency course, one of the things I've seen is just how trust has diminished in this country. A figure I heard the other day is that only 17% of Americans trust the national government. That's a deplorable stat. I also want somebody who has a belief in values of justice and equality and the ability to take constructive criticism, which means surrounding yourself by a wide spectrum of ideological advisors, and also a respect and a belief in experts in individual fields. Transparency is also critical. And one more, if I might add, the ability to self-deprecate. There's something to be said about being able to mock oneself and take a joke. That says something about a lot of character.
Thank you, Dr. Natoli. Dr. Silver, same question to you. What characteristics do voters want in a president?
Well, thank you, and thanks for organizing this. This is a really great opportunity, I think, to speak to folks in the Emmanuel community, especially such a big election coming up. I think that, so I think it was Thomas Cronin who talked about the presidential paradox, about what American voters look for in a president, right? And we tend to think about this where they want somebody who, that's approachable, like an everyday person, average person, but somebody who's also has exemplary characteristics, whether it be intelligence, whether it be work ethic or these types of things, somebody who has principles and sticks to these goals, right, and has a plan, but also somebody who may not necessarily be too rigid, right? So I think the point is that we, the people, are a little inconsistent about, according to this theory anyway, about what it is we look for in a president, right? I remember when President Bush, George W. Bush was running, the idea was like, oh, he's somebody you can have a beer with, as somebody looked at that as a positive characteristic, but the question is whether or not, that is something that is an exemplary characteristic or not. I mean, I don't know. It depends on the people, but I think that the gist of it is that we, the people, don't necessarily know. We're conflicted in our own way in how we assess these individuals.
Thank you. Dr. Vamvakas, same question. What characteristics do voters look for in a president?
Good evening to everybody, and thanks for putting this together. I think, it's a very difficult question to answer. It's almost like, looking in a crystal ball and seeing like, what people necessarily want. And I think in some ways it speaks to, our political culture, that it's fairly diverse, and we might be looking for the ideals like, of, character and trust and the other criteria that Professor Natoli pointed out. But at the same time, there's a growing sense of getting things done and having some kind of a sense of accountability and efficiently delivering on some of the things that, people want. And I think one of the major things for me is that sort of like the split that exists in our society between quantitative and qualitative needs, that we have a growing inequality and a growing difference of perception of what is it that we want. There is a, geographic as well as gender, as well as racial division in the country as far as the quantitative versus the qualitative. At the same time, there are people who are looking for issues of sustainability or climate change or identity politics. People are also looking for jobs, looking for health, or looking for education, some of the more quantitative demands that people have. And it's very, very difficult. I think it's increasingly difficult to just put, one structure around the characteristics that you're looking at. Sometimes, we could be looking for a president in the character of the president and then missing out on some of the other pieces. And we have, like we've all had the experience of the last 4 years. And I think that also taints, our answer in some way. I think overall, we have to recognize that we're living in multiple Americas at the same time. And depending where we want, we sort of like ask different questions. So I think it's a difficult question for me to answer, like, what is it that the 330 million Americans are looking for in a president?
You're absolutely right. And last but not least, the same question to Dr. Lenoir Martin. What characteristics do voters want in a president?
It's very nice of my colleagues to go before me, because you have a number of very important characteristics that have all been laid out. And I'll just answer just a few, add a few. Inclusivity, I think that's something very important, and compassion. A thoughtful, deliberative person, someone who really takes the issues seriously, and respect for other leaders, respect for people, respect for the issues and the seriousness of the issues that come to the president. So I'd add those to the list as well. Thank you.
Back to Dr. Natoli. What do you think are the most important issues of this election year?
Particularly the COVID pandemic. Related to that is, even though when it's interesting when pollsters look at this, they separate them out, but healthcare, the two obviously overlap at this juncture, especially. Racism has been a consistent issue. It's been one that's been with us for hundreds of years, and it doesn't go away. And it's just taken on, particularly in the last 4 years, it's taken on all the more of a distasteful characteristic or subculture in American politics. And Relatedly to that, we see the events of Philadelphia, and that speaks to another piece of what's wrong with the big picture. I'm not faulting police at this point. What I'm suggesting is that we need to do something with our mental health care system in this country. We'll get more details out of Philadelphia, but it seems to be that there was a clear-cut need for mental health in that particular case, and something that the police were burdened with that they should not have been burdened with. So I would say the COVID vaccine and relatedly healthcare, racism, but more pervasively, going back to our first question, leadership that is compassionate, that understands, that doesn't mock anyone, that doesn't mock the scientists. We need somebody who believes in science. So brings us to one other thing that I'll mention, and that is climate change. If we're not dealing with climate change, we may as well, just go into an eternal pandemic. We're destroying ourselves. I often look at the pandemic in a bizarre way, and I think it's Mother Nature taking care of herself, getting us out of the streets, getting people off the highways, getting factories closed. And it's kind of bizarre because you can see the sky better. It's the terrible way to have this have been achieved, but we have to not forget about climate change in this whole thing. So those are my few thoughts on what's critical right now. But again, COVID and racism and how they interact, because as you know, there's an extraordinary racial and ethnic disparity in the way the virus is hitting.
Excellent points. Thank you. To piggyback on that, Dr. Silver, why do you think issues, this is another pre-submitted question, why do you think issues such as climate change and COVID-19 have become political rather than problems for us to collectively work against?
I think, that's a big question to unpack, right? And so I think if we look at climate change has been something that has been, part of forces along the way because it speaks to views of the role of the government. It speaks to policy issues. It speaks to the failure, I would argue, of both political parties in the United States to address fundamental issues in regards to the economy, in regards to environmental concerns, to really tackle these things. It also speaks to our issues globally, right? So anything related to, and I know my colleagues can speak to this, but anything relating to environmental policy affects international policy. And so there's all these confluence of issues. And I think, you look at that and it becomes a part of this role of interests who are trying to influence the government. It speaks to political leaders who try to leverage their own positions in order to either get reelected or to advance their own aims. And so with that, and inevitably, unfortunately, in a two-party system like ours, in which we have seen increasing polarization along these lines, it becomes another football, if you will, to become part of that. And obviously, similarly, with the pandemic, which really just became part of electoral politics in this way, in this two-party system. And so when we look at it, we have increasing polarization amongst, political elites, which then translates down into the electorate, right? Because if you think about it, polarization occurs with these like political activists, these agents on the mid-level, not necessarily the political leaders, but these people who work for these political leaders. They in turn influence the political leaders, who then in turn influence the electorate. So that's kind of driving some aspects of polarization. And obviously it's you can go into much, other areas where it's complex. But then you think about the increasing tribalism of American politics along these partisan lines. So whatever my political leaders say is what I'm going to necessarily follow. Studies have shown that most Americans don't have a meaningful belief system in policies, and we respond arbitrarily to political leaders. And so this becomes part of it. And whether it be climate change, whether it be COVID, whether it be, I don't know, healthcare, whatever it is, right? It becomes part of this issue. So I I can elaborate upon it, but I'll yield the floor to my colleagues.
I don't want to have to hit the mute button. So, so our next question is in dealing with international and foreign policy issues to Dr. Martin. What are the major foreign policy issues that the next administration will have to deal with, in your opinion?
Okay, well, that'll take an hour or two, but I now that I know you have that mute button, I'll be very careful. We're in this balance of power world. So my students out there, former students and current students, you'll recognize that term. And we are now in a balance of power world. We're no longer in a unipolar world that sometimes was spoken of. And we need to look beyond military power as we cope with and think about this world that we live in. And we have to be able to work with our allies. And we need to be able to persuade them. And that comes with showing mutual respect. That's a really important issue. And it brings in our whole relationship, our whole need to strengthen our relationships with NATO and our relationship with with our friends in Latin America, in the Middle East, in Asia and Africa. And I'm also concerned about cybersecurity. And it's key. It's key to our military security. It's key to our industry. It's key to our health facilities and their records. I'm going to bring climate change out of domestic policy and into the international arena because it is a major issue. And I would hope that the Paris Climate Agreement would come up again for discussion. And because without the United States involved, and our leadership is missing, respect for the agreement goes down, and we can't expect others to live up to it. And I think it's important. It's an important beginning. We need to work on issues of immigration and the needs of the developing world. People are being ripped away, feel they have to rip themselves away from their world because of instability, because there's no future for them. And addressing those issues in the developing world will be a kindness and a compassionate world, a thing to do in this world. And it also will, I think, alleviate some of these terrible scenes we've seen of immigrants being locked out and of the developed world. We have to concentrate on building our trade and our strong economy, and that's international for sure. Issues of nuclear control, control on nuclear weapons, and that's multifaceted. I won't go through it all because I'm afraid you'll hit that mute button. It involves Russia, it involves Iran, it involves hopefully China to control these nuclear weapons and negotiations on it. I also want to add a few more. Vigilance, continuing vigilance on groups like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State in Syria, in Yemen, all these places which are disintegrating in chaos, unstable, and leave openings for them. So as I said, Syria, Yemen, Libya, Somalia, Nigeria, and we could go on. We also have to be concerned about an aggressive Russia, an aggressive Syria, and Iran again, and North Korea. So that should keep the State Department and the NSC working for quite a bit, maybe non-sleep for those next 4 years.
Great, thank you. So the same question now to Petros with regard to the Eastern Mediterranean region. What are the major foreign policy issues that the next administration will have to deal with, in your opinion?
I think since 2004, we have really have reached some kind of a turning point in American foreign policy. And the US has been sort of trying to figure out its footing after 2004. I think I agree with Professor Martin in in the post-unilateral moment kind of a thing. We had like that hegemonic, like, toying with the idea of the U.S. being this unilateral actor. And I think that that mission accomplished moment, it was more like a wishful thinking kind of a thing in July of 2004. Since then, I think the U.S. has gone beyond its limits in some way. The argument of like blood and treasure has reached its limit. So we have a United States, and I would say the Obama administration and the Trump administration have been trying to find their footing in different ways as far as the world order is concerned. Remember, it was the Obama administration that talked about pivoting to Asia, which really left a sort of like everybody really uncertain as to where the U.S. is going. If there is such a thing as a Trump doctrine, the Trump doctrine is more like this idea of like, let's make a deal, and regardless of what's out there. I think for the Eastern Mediterranean, the biggest thing that I see is if we do have a change in government in January 20th on, this administration has moved forward and made this, sort of like axis structure in that part of the world with like, tying places like the Emirates and Saudi Arabia to Israel and possibly Greece and Cyprus in an alliance structure. And I'm not necessarily certain if the next administration, if it's a Biden administration, if we don't flip back to being more proximate to Iran rather than Saudi Arabia. I think there's a major difference between the last two administrations. The previous administration, the Obama administration, was closer to, getting closer to Iran. This administration, for whatever reason, it could be personal interest. Professor Martin probably has a better sense of that than I do. But this administration certainly has flipped over to Saudi Arabia. So the Saudi Arabia versus Iran argument might be something that we see flipping in the region in a different way. Another country that I see like, being a big issue in the Eastern Mediterranean, and I'm sure Professor Martin will agree with this as well, is Turkey. I mean, Turkey seems to be completely untethered right now, untethered from the Western alliance. And the Turkey that doesn't only want to reverse the last 100 years, but maybe go back to the pre-Kuchuk Narji period, meaning before the sick men of Europe Turkey. That could be a major monkey wrench in the whole international system, because here's a country with revisionist ambitions, and that could be really problematic for the U.S. So the U.S., I think it needs to, whoever leads the U.S. administration on January 20th, I think they're going to find an international landscape that's really very, very difficult to transverse.
Thank you. So our next question is to Marie. How do unexpected events, like the ones that we've mentioned, the ones you mentioned before, how do those affect the course of an election year? How do those impact campaigning, candidates? Yeah.
Well, if you think about the dynamics of events since, take a year ago, even though, as I mentioned earlier, racism has always been an undercurrent in our political system, it's been exacerbated over the last 3+ years. That having been said, the George Floyd phenomenon was critical in energizing what was already a movement, the Black Lives Matter movement. The same thing is true about the beginning of the COVID pandemic. Things that an administration was not expected to handle, but suddenly had to grapple with. So things erupt and they have to have a response. Otherwise, you're going to have the kind of set of dynamics that we have now, which is that no one is in charge. No one is in charge. And besides that, there's a heck of a lot of misinformation running rampant across all of these information, or all of these things. Another factor I would put in there was the unfortunate passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg that brought in another set of unexpecteds that have been partially resolved, but on the other hand, have raised other issues that we're going to have to face. We have to face issues about what our judicial system is all about. Now, that's not going to be handled by this election per se, but it is, again, an undercurrent about the political arena that has rushed to judgment about her replacement. So I think that, I mean, these things come up as issues that were not expected to come up as issues. And surrounding all of them tend to be misinformation, which, from my reading, Americans are increasingly feeling as if they've got more information, misinformation than they have information. So I think when I talk about the unexpected issues that come up, this is what should be anticipated, but it just seems as if there's been a barrage, particularly in the last year. That having been said, you know, we could go back to before the Trump election and look at the coming of the Trump election. If you go back and you look at the issues in the couple of years before Trump was elected, it was predictable that there was a right-wing populism in it brewing. And that set the scene for 2016. I mean, I looked at this with hindsight. You know, I wish I had looked at it with foresight. But with hindsight, I said, this was inevitable. This was not a surprise. So I think that when we look at these unexpecteds, we have to say, how do they play out now? But they're not over and done with, even if we think that they're over and done with in the short run, because there's going to be a continuing undercurrent. An expected issue is the aftermath of this election. Win or lose, whichever side wins or loses, there are going to be problems in the streets. And that's something that I hope we would avoid as a country, but I think we have to be ready for it. So does anybody want to add anything to that?
Oh yeah, no, thank you, Marie. I think that was excellent. Like, I think the issue with election years and campaigns, right? We look at campaigns and there are certain fundamentals in a race that are considered, right? So you think about the demographics of the district, who's running, what's the partisan breakdown of the district? If you're thinking about, obviously, in a presidential level, you're looking at with the various states and which states are necessarily, up for grabs or leaning one way or the other about where campaigns choose to devote resources. You think about the partisan climate of who's in the White House, right? So, we've had a Republican president now. This is 4 years or one term, right? So if you think about back in 2016, you're thinking about Democrats vying for a third consecutive presidential term, which is very difficult, right? So the fundamentals, you think about the state of the economy as a fundamental, right? And these are things that campaigns can try to plan for as best as possible, right? And they make choices based on this. But then there's also the things that, Marie is mentioning, right? Like these things that happen that you can't necessarily plan for, whether it be, an uptick in, George Floyd's murder, for example, or the pandemic, although, the former vice president would argue that the Obama administration did provide a playbook in order how to deal with something like this. So there's some of these issues that come up, and how a campaign deals with it throughout the electoral cycle it can make or break a campaign. And you're looking at the presidential level, and then obviously you can look at campaigns on the state and local level as well, about how these things factor into it. So campaigns are essentially about choices, right, that they make, and then the chances, right? What happens through that process, and what things can they not necessarily control? And I think it's important to consider that. And then and we could talk about the Biden campaign and the Trump campaign throughout the cycle, allocation of funds, where they're choosing a target, but based on their responses to the pandemic as well as other issues. But I think that just to complement what Marie was talking about there.
Right. Petros, it seemed like you had something to add as well in terms of the question, how do unexpected events affect the course of an election?
I just want to add a couple of points, and I think in some manner that both all these unexpected events have become politicized. Even George Floyd's murder. I mean, yes, the Black Lives Matter movement started in 2017, but it just seemed to be like dormant for a long time. And whether it was a movement or not, a lot of people were like debating about all of those things. And then all of a sudden, it just catches on as far as pushing it forth. And the same thing with the pandemic. I think fundamentally, some of these issues are things that are, there, and they have been there for some time. They've been dormant. And I wonder whether if it wasn't an election year and using, this kind of light on these issues, we would have a completely different take on it. Yes, the pandemic is very real, but the fact that we are, I think Professor Silva said something to that earlier, the fact that we have really completely gutted our healthcare system in 40 years of neoliberal reform since the Reagan administration, that also points to the fact that, we, on all the social issues, including education or healthcare or providing like decent employment, those are all things that leave us very, very vulnerable. And all of a sudden, this pandemic, we're taking the approach of the Middle Ages to deal with the pandemic, namely lockdowns and masks, instead of just being able to deal with it in a very meaningful way. As a parent, you send your kids to their rooms when you have failed parenting. So locking societies up is sort of like a failure of advanced democracies to deal with some of these issues, because we're going to have more pandemics coming in a very interwoven world. And the same thing with like the issues of police brutality or excessive policing. This is nothing new. I mean, as long as I remember, we have all kinds of incidents of police brutality and all kinds of incidents of excessive force. So some of these issues get a bigger focus, and they really take away from the fundamental issues that I think we should be addressing in such an election.
Now, just one quick thing, but speaking about George Floyd, yeah, the Black Lives Matter movement had begun some years ago, but you know what? I look upon the George Floyd murder as the straw that broke the camel's back. It was like, that's it. This is too much. Enough's enough. We'd had it. And why not carpe diem and seize the moment of a presidential election, particularly in the face of the kind of racist tensions being generated by our current leadership. The role of white supremacists in this country has been elevated to the point where they are considered to be legitimate actors. So you've got that factor woven in, with the president of the United States not being willing to disavow them and saying that they are good people. So you got to look at that too. I mean, we're supposed to be neutral here, but to be neutral is not to say what's happening. And what's happening is that you've got somebody in the White House who won't face the reality of the animosities that he has generated and really has to put a lid on. And it could only get worse after the election, regardless, as we said earlier, who wins. So I had to add that. But George Floyd was the straw that broke the camel's back.
Great point. Thank you, Marie. So our next question is to Lenore, one of the pre-submitted questions. President Trump emphasized the America First approach to his foreign policy efforts, including his relations with China. How should America handle its relationship with China over the next 4 years?
Thank you very much for that question. It's a key question. China's big in so many ways. It's important for us to think of when it presents enormous challenges, right? In 4 areas: trade, military, it's becoming a military challenge. It's taken over or attempting to take over the South China Sea. It has developed something called the Belt and Road Initiative, which is reviving the old Silk Road. And we also have to think about it as really failing when it comes to fulfilling or even coming near human rights when we think of the Uyghur issue. So I'd like to take a few minutes to look at most of those. Trade. The trade war with China did not really reduce the trade deficit for this country. In fact, what happened was we turned to other countries like Vietnam, Mexico, to fulfill what we weren't getting from abroad, from China. And therefore, our trade deficit is even bigger than it was before we started this trade war with China. It did reduce the deficit for a while with China, that policy, but it was, in fact, it didn't ultimately do us very much good in manufacturing. What we found is that because there's a trade-off, for some manufacturing areas, it was good, and for some, it was very bad. And there's actually higher unemployment now in manufacturing than there was before this trade war with China. So putting all that together, after the beginning of the pandemic, the trade deficit with China is the same as it was before. So it's gotten us absolutely nowhere at all. So that's trade. And we're going to have those challenges. They are challenges, they're real challenges, but necessarily throwing on tariffs the way we did, heavy duty tariffs, isn't necessarily the best way to deal with those trade challenges. As I mentioned, China's building up its military. We have to be very conscious of that. The South China Sea has it's enormously important, and it's sending the buildup by China in the South China Sea is sending tremors through some of our friends in the area. It's for those of us in my generation, this is going to be a surprise. I'm going to include Vietnam in that. Vietnam is very, very concerned about the buildup of China in the South China Sea. The Philippines, Indonesia, Taiwan. So these are enormous challenges from China that this next administration is going to have to deal with. And I want to take just a minute or two to talk about this Belt and Road Initiative, which some people might be aware of, some not so aware of. So it's looking very positive for many states. Many countries around the world are dealing, yeah, you want to build a port? In my area, we see some of it, Dr. Vamvakas will tell you, in the Mediterranean, some important ports, one of them in Turkey. Interestingly enough, one in Haifa, in Israel. And what these ports do is they look very peaceful. China's putting a lot of money into them. China loans money to some states to build them. They bring their own workers, they bring their own technology in. It's all very positive, good for trade. But what does it mean in the future? What are these ports, what are they ultimately going to be used for? Can they be used militarily? So there are a lot of challenges from China, and we need some very good people in the White House and in the State Department to think about it, and not because China is important to us and China is presenting challenges. So no broad strokes, just careful planning in the future.
The next question is to Petros. Petros, you recently spent several weeks traveling from the Northeast to Texas, teaching from the road, and watching how, in the midst of a pandemic and a presidential race, the fabric of America is unfolding. Can you tell us what you found and what impacted you the most on that trip?
Thanks for the question. I spent 4 weeks from September 14th to October 10th, going from Lawrence, Massachusetts to Laredo, Texas. I visited 12 communities which have a majority Hispanic or Latino population. It was part of my politics of race and ethnicity in Latin America, and took the opportunity to teach my other courses from those locations as well. So one of the things that that's the very first point is that the fact that this Latin America exists, in North America, that it's not necessarily a place that has geographic configuration, but it's everywhere, and it really points to the mixture of the United States and the urban structure of the United States, where Latino populations have moved in. The other point on that Latino population is that I think it's a misnomer to put them all at one group and talk about the Latino vote. That's really an erroneous kind of an assessment to make. There are 21 countries that are represented in the Latino population, and actually you have Puerto Ricans who are American. They're not a different state or a different country. So that was something that's of an observation. The other is that there are three Americas there, that you can just, look as far as the urban, suburban, and rural. And they have very different characteristics. And even like, you can look at the lawn, the front lawn signs that we see in the suburbs and, with all the politics and the lawn front. And then when you move to the urban, that's the suburbs. When you move to the urban areas, those urban areas are very different. You don't see any signage whatsoever for the national candidates. The national politics are not displayed. And then when you go out to the rural areas, you have the billboard kind of like, politics that you see in the billboards. And then you can see like the difference is that the suburbs do tend to be more, with the Biden-Harris signs, and then the billboards, once you move about 27 miles west of Washington, D.C., and you're in the, Western Virginia kind of an area, all the way to the borders of New Mexico, you see nothing but Trump signs. It's the Bible Belt, of course, and you see that. But once you reach New Mexico, it changes again. So you do have like that very different kind of a landscape. And one of the reasons for the trip was, to see America outside of the bubble, of the Northeast bubble that we're in. And, my discovery is that there are multiples of bubbles. There is like a Northeast bubble. There's also a Texas bubble, and there's a New Mexico bubble, and there's like a Tennessee bubble, so on and so forth. And, going back to that first question that you raised about what, Americans, look for in their president, it just depends where you stand and which bubble you're referring to, that, you get a different take. And even right here in Boston, I mean, I can tell you that going over the Tobin Bridge and going to Chelsea, that Tobin Bridge is not a bridge at all. That Tobin Bridge is a wall. It's a completely two different Americas on that other side of the Tobin Bridge. There's 80% of the people in Chelsea have to go out and work. There's no ability for them to work from home. All of those people that work every day, they get, they cash jobs, which means that they have multiple jobs. So even like tracing, is very, very difficult. Social distancing is impossible, as people live like, they have up to 40 people maybe in a 3-decker. So it's very, very difficult to talk about social distancing. It's very, very difficult to do virtual learning. There are 4,000 families in the city of Chelsea that need daily assistance as far as food intake. The city of Chelsea can only afford to do 2,000, and that's right across Boston itself. Reading, Pennsylvania, which is, the size of Newton, Massachusetts in population. Reading, 88,000 people. Median household income in Reading, Pennsylvania is $26,000. In Newton, Massachusetts is $143,000. The poverty rate in Newton is 4%. The poverty rate in Reading, Pennsylvania is 36%. 36%. So when we're talking about, this blanket America or United States, it's just like this, very difficult to really gauge, and it's very difficult to gauge what policy means for a lot of people. And it leads me to that original point that I was making about quantitative versus qualitative needs. This, I doubt that, the issue of sustainability really gets to the people in Reading, Pennsylvania. It's important, but it's not in the forefront. And one last observation right here in the city of Boston, or the Oxford. So the statue of Columbus in the North End was taken down, right? The statue of Columbus in Chelsea is alive and well, and it's there in the middle of Chelsea. And it gives you an indication of the priorities in the different communities. And, like I said, only the Tobin Bridge connects both of those areas. So there was a lot to discover, and it was a really, really very fruitful kind of a trip.
So just building off what Petros was saying, because we had talked about this, I was fortunate to be able to zoom into two of his classes and have some of the discussion about this with about Latino voters, and I obviously he's right about the idea that we don't want to homogenize a group that's not necessarily homogenous, right? Different backgrounds and stuff like that. And there's obviously a lot being said about the Latino vote in the election, and they're very difficult to gauge accurately. But I think it's important for us to recognize also that there is a shared experience for a large aspect of the Latino community, and there's a push, there's a Latino Victory organization which tries to recruit and elect Latino candidates, right, for more representation in elected offices. There's Latino Decisions, which looks at, started by Dr. Matt Barreto, which tries to focus on the Latino community. So the point I'm trying to make is that if we disaggregate a group, right, which has historically been marginalized, it only serves to further marginalize a population, right? There's strength in numbers, right? So while there's an idea to be well-meaning from folks not to, the idea of to glob a group together, I think it's important that they're not mutually exclusive, right? There's a way I would argue for us to focus a group with a shared experience, but also recognize the heterogeneity within it. So I just wanted to compliment what, Petros was saying, just to illustrate that a little bit as well.
So this is our last question. And then again, I want to allow each one of you time for kind of a parting thought. And Adam, this goes to you. It was one of our pre-submitted questions and actually one of our live questions that was just submitted. So I'm kind of paraphrasing, but it talks about November 4th. And, are there concerns with regard to, if necessary, a transfer of power or retention of power, and what are your concerns with regard to, let's just look at the day of November 4th.
Well, I mean, I don't think we're going to fully know, right? Because I think the way votes are being counted and stuff like that, there's a great article about how they talk about this blue shift, with counting of absentee ballots. And just while we're on the call, the Supreme Court refused to hear the Republican appeal from Pennsylvania, again, to curb the extension of that, of the extension of the absentee ballots within Pennsylvania. I mean, I don't know. I think that there's, some folks, there's a lot to be said about concern about what's going to happen. I just feel that the system is so, the idea, so, all right. So let's say the president, tries to say, question the validity of the ballots, which he has said publicly, right? For that to hold, right? And it's not saying it doesn't hold, right? You're asking elected officials in all these different states to invalidate the ballots that they may have won on, right? So let's say, you're looking at Republican legislators who win in a certain state, let's say North Carolina. Let's say the president loses North Carolina, but the Republicans hold on to the state legislature there, right? You're asking all those electeds in the state legislature in North Carolina to then discount the ballots on which they prove to be successful. So it's not saying it won't be done, right? Maybe they think that the ballots underrepresented them, undercounted them. I don't know. So, but I just feel that there's a lot to be said about this, and I don't know what the right answer is. I just feel that we have to go down the ballot and see what happens. And you're also challenging the integrity, which, people on both sides because states run these elections, and they're all going to suddenly say that this person, because they're the opposite party, doesn't have the integrity to uphold the election on which they are trying to run. Again, doesn't mean that they are lacking in integrity or not. It just means that I think sometimes we're so quick to, have a sky is falling scenario. And I think a lot has also been made about what the media does and how the media portrays it. And I think that's a key thing. I will say that Justice Kavanaugh's concurring opinion in the Wisconsin case is troubling to me, though. And I'm sure Dr. Natoli can speak to this as well as my colleagues, but that's problematic. And his citation of a footnote from Justice Rehnquist in the Bush v. Gore decision as precedent is also somewhat problematic too. So I'll leave that. I don't want to take up too much more time.
Okay, thank you, Adam. So that gives us a minute each for final thoughts.
I guess I would concentrate on, when I think about this election, the importance of leadership and the leadership to address poverty, to address inclusivity, as I mentioned before, to something I didn't mention, invest in science, research and development. When I was thinking about China, I should have mentioned that is a way to address the challenge of China. And it's also the way to address so many of the issues that we have on pollution and climate. You know, addressing climate and climate change is, of course, an international issue, but we can't, you know, this is a situation where rich and poor are suffering today. The fires in California and the floods and hurricanes in Louisiana are wiping out the rich and the poor. So on this, Petros, I just want to bring out, there's no separation. That bridge that you referred to is not a wall in those situations. We're all suffering from that. We're all suffering from racism and inclusivity. And so I just want to, I'll end with that.
Great. So final thoughts, Petros.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I mean, I think it's just a matter of priorities. I think people who are living in Chelsea, you know, are suffering the racism every day. So it's part of that. It's part of what they experience. So it's not necessarily that kind of a thing. To the election, I think overall, I think both, you know, to me, and maybe this might be an unpopular position, but I think both the Obama and the Trump, you know, presidencies are sort of like questioning presidencies for the United States that seems to be in a transition. We seem to be in a transition, and as outlandish to some people as Obama presented to be as a president, it's the same thing on the other side as far as Trump is, President Trump is concerned. On one end, we have the former academic President Obama, who speaks a particular language to a particular audience. And now we have the televangelist, you know, reality star kind of like president who speaks a very plain American language to another audience. I think we are in a polarized kind of a political system that goes back to the cultural wars of the 1960s that has been peeled back. And all this, you know, the more, the greater the inequality, the more we live in two parallel universes. And I think it's going to continue on for some time. I don't necessarily foresee that whoever is elected on next Tuesday, we're going to have some kind of a solution, I think. And whether Mr. Trump is that voice or not, I think that America will still exist. And whether Mr. Biden wins or not, that other America is also going to exist. I think it's going to take some time to bridge that gap. And I think the next administration is going to have to deal with some really big load of like issues that are in front of us, including the economy, including health, including education, including issues of, you know, of social concern as well.
Great. Thank you, Petros. I feel like we could talk for another 3 hours, but I just want to give everybody a chance to give their final thoughts. So Dr. Natoli, final thoughts.
Yes, thank you very much. You know, an undercurrent theme that's run throughout so much of what we talked about, but we haven't explicitly addressed, is something that drives me crazy. And that is the persistent poverty in this country that we're not addressing. And we're not willing to take this on. I think in one of the world's wealthiest country, I think it's despicable that so many children go to sleep at night without food. I think it's despicable that when we talk about why children should go back to school during the pandemic, it's so that they can get the only meal that they can have for the day. I think we need to address those kinds of issues. And it takes us to talking about something else, and that is a redistribution of wealth in this country. We need to really look at the tax system in this country. We need to much more appreciably look at the top of that tax structure and do something about that increasing disparity between the haves and the have-nots.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, final thought from Dr. Silver.
Okay, I'll keep it real brief because I know that we have to wrap up. So just I'll give from an election night aspect of it. Look at the Senate races, because usually for these toss-up races, they usually all go in one direction. They tend to go in one direction. And in 2016, the Senate and presidential races and for the state all went in the same way. So we'll see if that holds in 2020. And if the Democrats are banking on, like if the majority of the Senate is hinging on the 2 Georgia seats in January, which if it's a runoff votes, then it was not a good night on election night for the Democrats. If the Democratic majority is hinging on the 2 Georgia seats, was not a good night for the Democrats. So anyway, I'll just leave it at that.
Great. Well, I can't thank each of you enough for joining us this evening and making this such an informative and educational event. I really enjoyed talking with all of you. Thank you, Lenore, Marie, Petros, and Adam for joining us. And thank you for all of our registrations and for everybody for joining us. If you have not done so already, we strongly encourage you to get out the vote. Get out, vote early, vote often. No, please vote. Please consider voting if you have not already. Please be sure to watch emmanuel.edu/alumni for registration links for upcoming events. We will, our next event is on Sunday, the 1st. It's our annual Alumni Memorial Mass, which we will be live streaming from the chapel. There is a registration link to that on our website. And again, thank you everybody for coming, and we hope you have a pleasant evening.